Well, thank you very much, David, and it's my privilege to welcome you here to the Toulouse School of Economics. We have a very dedicated teaching administrative staff which is trying to help improve the service they offer. And if you have any suggestion, of course, we will welcome the suggestion. We hope that you are going to enjoy your studies here, for those of you who haven't been here yet. But in any case, a warm welcome. Warm, that's pretty warm. And I promise we didn't choose this amphitheater, which is very nice, but tends to be a bit hot when there have been classes before in June and September. As you all know, there is a COP, Conference of the Parties 21 in Paris in December. It's one of those big COPs, like 6 years ago, Copenhagen. And my talk will be about the concerns that I have about the outcome which will be reached at Paris. In a sense, it's a repeat. I'd expressed very similar concerns in Copenhagen, just before Copenhagen, in a report I'd written for the Prime Minister. And I'm very worried that this year will be a repeat. And I hope I'm completely wrong, because we are losing time. We have been losing time for a long time. And Kyoto was 18 years ago. And we cannot afford losing time anymore. Now, it's very striking how this is actually the beginning of the slide. It's the beginning of a slide I had 6 years ago or 7 years ago on the contrast between very ambitious targets for 2050. So countries were willing to promise almost anything for 2050, things which were compatible with the IPCC's objective of a warming of 2 degrees Celsius. But then when they were asked, what kind of commitments are you going to pledge and abide by 2020, then they kept silent. Now, you all know what has happened since Copenhagen. Nothing, almost nothing has happened. And the waiting game is still going on. And the question is, what kind of implications do you have, and what will be the roadmap for a conference in Paris? Now, as you may know, in Copenhagen, we use a pledge and review approach. So pledge and review is you offer your suggestion for what percentage, for example, you're going to reduce your emissions per unit of energy, per inhabitant, whatever. And then we discuss. There is absolutely no commitment which is made. And the Lima last year basically said we should keep doing that. So we keep relying on non-committal pledges. And for an economist, it's pretty painful because we are abandoning the idea of carbon pricing. The idea is that those who pollute should be paying for their pollution. Something which has been around for now 100 years in economics. And if you see what's going to happen in Paris, and again, I hope I'm completely wrong, but the way it's most likely to happen is that there won't be any discussion of the reporting and verification. So the measurement system, there is not even discussion of the measurement system, how each country is polluting, how much. About the enforcement, which is a tough thing, what happens if the pledges are not fulfilled? There's a discussion about whether we are going to have a least cost abatement. So let's assume that we can measure pollution. Let's assume we can enforce the promises, two big ifs. What happens if a country decides not to abide by the promises? We have seen that after Kyoto. We have seen that after Copenhagen. And probably we'll see that after Paris. What will happen if countries renege on their promises? And finally, the least cost abatement, of course, which is very dear to economists because we want efficiency. But of course, burden sharing, the allocation of efforts among countries and who is going to gain and lose is, of course, a big issue as well. Now, as you know, in Copenhagen, it was decided to create a green fund. So basically, the rich countries will contribute to a fund which will be used to help the poor countries face the transition. And the number was 100 billion per year. And if you look at what happened since, only 10 billion have been collected in stock, not in flow. And it's mainly Germany, France. It's epsilon, so almost no money has been collected, as you could expect. Okay, so there are costs of delaying negotiations. Now, you have all heard about free riding, the fact that I want you to put in efforts and I don't want to have any cost of effort, so I'm going to wait for you to do the job. Now, in the context of global warming, it's pretty big. So imagine that you are a country which has 1% of the world population, and that the consequences of global warming are distributed equally across countries. Of course, it's completely wrong. We know that some countries are going to suffer a lot, some are going to suffer very little, at least in the short run. But still, that means that anytime you reduce pollution, you're going to get only 1 out of 100 of the benefits. That means that basically it's a complete public good. You have very little incentive to reduce your pollution. I'll come back to that. So there is a very strong incentive to free ride. Now things are even worse than that, which is that even if you put in effort, it's not even clear that you'll reduce pollution. So there is a famous leakage prime. So, if I'm in a country where I put a price on carbon, I put efforts is incurred in order to reduce pollution in my country, then the production might shift to countries which have no carbon price. It's a form of dumping, it's environmental dumping. But in that case, I will have done very little to reduce pollution because my consumer will buy goods from countries which don't reduce their pollution. I could say the same thing about pricing of fossil energies. So for example, if I reduce transportation cost, pollution which comes from transportation or heating, housing or whatever, then I'm going to reduce the price of oil. But because the price of oil will have been reduced, then other countries will consume more oil, and it's not going to help. Same thing with the Clean Development Mechanism, which was an institution which was created by Kyoto, which at first sight was a pretty good idea, which is that, say, for example, if you implement a project which is going to reduce deforestation in Indonesia, then you're going to get credit for that, and the price of this credit will be the price, say, of carbon in Europe. So you get credit for that. And it looks like a good idea because you help poor countries. And on top of that, you have a market-based approach to knowing how much it's worth. The problem with that, one of the problems with the CDM mechanism is, of course, imagine that you put in some money to protect a forest in Indonesia. That looks very good on paper. But what happens then? Well, imagine what will have been done with the forest deforestation. You will have sold wood, you will have timber, you will have produced soy instead, and so on and so forth. But now if you economize and you keep this forest intact, which is very nice and very good, then that means that the price of wood is going to go up, the price of soy is going to go up, and then there will be more production, more deforestation elsewhere. So there is no solution unless you take a global approach. We must take a world approach. The last thing which is also very bad in terms of political economy is that it actually might be good for you to stay brown and not move green. Why? Because once there is a negotiation about binding agreement, which is still not now, then you can demand compensation. You are brown, you are not eager to move and change your technologies, and in that case, you'll get compensation. It's not moral at all. Okay, understand me well. It's not moral at all. But if you look at all the negotiations which have been successful, there's always been compensation to the reluctant countries. So a very famous example is SO2 in the US in 1990, where the clean states, the two coasts, had to pay a bribe to the Midwest because, of course, all the pollution came from the Midwest. And they got a bribe out of that. That's political economy. It has nothing to do with morality, unfortunately. Okay? So it's very dangerous. Now you're going to object that maybe in the end there will be some action. So proponents of pledge and review say, no, look, everybody's nice, everybody's is undertaking some action to reduce the environmental pollution. However, you have to take into account that a lot of this reduction is actually completely selfish and basically addresses the concerns in the country as opposed to the world concerns. So for example, imagine that you're a country like Poland or China, where lots of countries are using a lot of coal. Coal is terrible for CO2 emissions, but you have to remember that coal also emits a lot of SO2 and all kinds of acid rain pollutants, which is more local pollution. So all those countries have an incentive to build coal power plants which are more efficient, which are going to use low sulfur coal and so on, but it's going to reduce the pollution of CO2 as a byproduct of reducing the pollution of SO2. So from a purely selfish point of view, you're going to reduce the pollution of SO2, and in the process, by chance, you will reduce the pollution of CO2. Now, a country like China, which is actually pretty big, also is going to internalize some fraction of the benefits. It's pretty exposed to global warming damages. And then every country wants to placate the domestic opinion at home and avoid international pressure. So there will be actions. I mean, and there are actions already. It's not like there is no action. There is some action, but those actions will be very insufficient because they are basically the selfish actions that you will be undertaking anyway. Now we have to go further if we want to avoid leaving to future generations a catastrophe. Okay? And just a point about screening. Lots of people say we don't want any binding agreement. Well, you should be suspicious about that. Because if you intend to abide by your promises, then it's your interest to sign a binding agreement, right? Because you would like the others to do the same. So the people who object to binding agreements often are politicians who don't expect to actually abide by their promise. They want to promise something, but free promise, and of course to renege on it. So the economic principles, we know you're economist. The economic principles were designed 100 years ago by Pigou. What we lack is, we would like to have all kinds of economic agents, consumers, firms, administrations. We want them to internalize the damage they do to society. So we want them to pay the social cost of their pollution. So we want carbon pricing in the particular instance. And the logic of that, if you push it to the end, is very, very simple, is that you want pollution to be eliminated when the cost of depolluting is larger than the social cost of pollution, and you want to let it happen when, I'm sorry, did I get the sign wrong? Okay, you like to have depollution anytime the marginal cost of depolluting is smaller than social cost, and conversely. Okay, and in principle, in the ideal world, you like to have one price, the same worldwide for all sectors, and also you need some consistency over time. That's called the Hotelling rule. It's very simple, it's efficient, it works for other pollutants. Instead of that, we use command and control, and some people want to use command and control. Command and control is all kinds of interference with the mechanism of one price, which is going to basically make things a bit inefficient. Examples, a typical example is an emission standard, and you have to understand me well. I'm not against all emission standards. Actually, I think some of them can be extremely useful, precisely because the players are not always well informed or are too short-sighted. So let me give you an example. For insulations, consumers, you and me, are very poorly informed about the apartment or the house energy properties. We don't know how much we are going to economize when we improve the insulation. We may be a bit myopic. The benefits will be in a while. So in principle, you could give the carbon price, a pass of the carbon price, as an incentive to invest in insulation, but the consumer may not be completely informed, or they may be a bit myopic, or they may be liquidity constrained, something like that. So a standard can be good. What I don't like about standard is that many standards actually enacted without any computation of the implicit carbon price or implicit price. So maybe some standards may correspond to 500 euros per ton, whereas there are things we could do at 5 euros per ton we don't do at this stage. So it's a very, very big disaster. Bans is of course an extreme case. Subsidies to sources of energies or whatever. And the reasoning as an economist, you understand it. Imagine that you have two firms, or you could use two sectors or two countries, and they each emit 2 tons of CO2, so you have 4 tons overall. And then we decide that we have to cut pollution by half. So we decide basically to move from 4 tons to 2 tons. And let's imagine that firm A has a cheap abatement cost, so it costs only 10 euros to get rid of the pollution, whereas for firm B, it's a costly abatement and it costs 100 euros per ton. Now, you may think, if you're a politician, let's have a fair mechanism, a fair policy in which each is going to reduce pollution by a half. Now, it's going to be very inefficient because you are going to have a total cost of pollution, which will be 10 plus 100, because you use firm B also to reduce the pollution. Whereas if you wanted to minimize the cost of doing it, it should be firm A, which reduces the pollution. And instead of having a total cost of 110, you could have a total cost of 20. And I tell you, it's very important for the economy, but it's also very important for the environment, because if it's too expensive, in the end, any ambitious policy will be basically overturned. So the political economy also mandates to have a very efficient policy. Now, there are various ways of doing that. You can use a carbon tax. You could use pollution permits. So, for example, you can distribute 1 pollution permit to each. So in total, you have a pollution of 2. And of course, in that case, B, which is for whom it's very expensive to depollute, to abate, is going to buy 1 permit from A, and then you'll get the efficient solution. Okay? Now, you may think it's completely abstract, but it's not abstract. So imagine, for example, that you decide that France and Poland or China have to reduce the CO2 content of electricity production by the same amount. That will be crazy. That will be crazy simply because France, 80% of electricity production is nuclear power. So there is no CO2 emission. And that will be extremely expensive for France to, reduce pollution on the electricity side. Whereas for a country which uses a lot of coal, at the margin you can do lots of things by having through a cost difference which is not that big. Now, that raises a question, is that fair? I mean, do we want to leave it upon some countries to reduce their pollution and not to others? That's a different question. I'm here talking about the efficiency dimension. In general, as an economist, just to oversimplify, you have a quantity which is a quantity of pollution, and then you have a carbon price. And then you have a curve which basically is going to show you how much pollution there will be at each price. And here I'm not looking at the intertemporal aspects and so on and so forth. If you have a higher carbon price, you'll have less pollution, okay? So there will be more effort not to consume and to install new equipments, which are green, okay? And you can use either a price or a quantity, and in practice, both mechanisms exist. So the first mechanism is a carbon tax. You have to pay 50 euros per ton that you emit. The other one is pollution or tradable emission rights, in which there is a set of rights which is created, and then they are traded on the market. And they are traded on a market which also clear the market. So in the end, you can either take the blue route and set a tax, and then you end up with some pollution, or take the red route where you set a market for permits, tradable emission rights, and then there will be a price in this market. Now, if you know the demand curve, then you know exactly what to do, and it doesn't matter if you use a carbon tax or tradable permit system like we have in Europe. Either way, once you have uncertainty, things have become more difficult. They become more difficult statically. You must have some kind of mixture of the two. or dynamically because there's the issue about commitment. So we are going to get things wrong. We know that we don't know the climate change technology science so well. We don't know the technologies and the technological progress. I mean, take photovoltaic, for example. You know, photovoltaic was outrageously expensive. Huge amount of money. We spent a lot of money on that. But it turns out the learning curve was pretty good. Actually, much better than we had. Usually, the learning curve are always exaggerated. In the case of photovoltaic, actually, the learning curve was much better than we thought. So the point is that we don't know the technological progress. We don't know what's going to work. You know, we need technological progress 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And we don't know what's going to work. So there is a lot of uncertainty, so we need to adjust. Actually, it's an issue we had studied 20 years ago with Jean-Jacques Lafont. We published some papers on how to do it when you have uncertainty about this demand curve. Cap and trade, which is basically the quantity approach, the permits approach, has been used many times, sometimes very successfully. There's a very well-designed experiment, some very poorly designed experiment. Economists have something to say about that. Here are some examples. And there are political economy, and I have to tell you, that's an area economists agree. Also, some don't agree. Actually, many of the people who are now negotiating the Paris Agreement, they don't agree with an economic approach. But most economists, almost all economists, agree with the economic approach. We need a price, we need a signal so as to give the right incentive to the economic agents. But where we don't agree, and have to be very transparent on that, is which way you want to do it. Do you want a tax, or do you want a permit, a cap and trade approach? And there are different views. So there's actually a special issue of a journal specialized on the environment, and you'll be receiving, if you haven't received it yet, a link, because all the articles are available on free access. And the articles by people like Joe Stiglitz or Bill Nordhaus or Peter Crampton, who actually argue in favor of price approach, and people like Christian Gollier and myself who argue in favor of cap and trade. So you can read those articles and see the arguments in those papers and let you decide for yourself. And our view with Christian Gollier is that we favor the cap and trade approach because of the verification. It's a political economy argument, really, because of the difficulty to verify a tax collection approach. So if you take the tax collection, I mean, and by the way, there are more subtle things. So when you look, for example, at the paper by Crampton et al., it's not quite a carbon tax. It's different from that. But let me just take a carbon tax. A carbon tax, we're going to agree, for example, that the carbon tax is everywhere 50 euros. But then, right now, it's at most 5 euros. As you know, the price of carbon in most countries, except in Sweden, is basically 5 euros at most. Sometimes it's 0 euros. Okay? So the question is, who is going to enforce that? Okay? Because domestic interest groups in each country are going to say, no, why should we do all the work? We are paying a carbon tax of 50 euros. Of course, it stays with the government, but it's still a cost to the country. And they could already actually have a carbon tax of 50 euros, and they don't do it. So there's an issue with enforcement, which is, if you ask a country to put in some effort, then the tax collection effort is going to be extremely weak. The country has no incentive to spend resources in enforcing something that benefits the rest of the world. And then it can undo the tax. So imagine, for example, you put a tax on gasoline. Then what you can do, and some countries have already done that, is basically to undo the carbon tax on gasoline, and you reduce the other taxes. So in the end, it's a wash. You haven't done anything. So you have to check all those things. And how do you account for standards, for example? If you want to account for standards, you must compute the the equivalent price which corresponds to that standard. It's very difficult. How do you deal with subsidiarity? So, for example, if you have a carbon tax of 50 euros, and the country tells you, I'm India, for example, and I don't want a carbon tax of 50 euros on cement because cement is consumed by poor people to build their house. And I don't want to do that. We as economists will say, no, we understand, but then you should rather give money to the poor than distorting the price system. But let's assume you can't. Then there's a legitimate argument of saying, well, let's make an exception for cement. Okay? But then if you start making assumptions, where do you stop? And something I want to insist on is that the rich countries should do a lot of effort, but global warming is never going to be solved with a rich country. You need the poor countries, the emerging countries, to put in a lot of effort as well. And that, of course, raises an issue with equity, because those countries have been saying, actually, since Rio and Kyoto, they've been saying, look, we want to finance our growth, we want to be developed, we want to become developed countries, and now you are going to kill our growth through a carbon tax or the equivalent in terms of cap and trade. So that's going to be an issue, but we need India, China, Brazil, and every country in the world to face a price on carbon. That's the efficient thing, otherwise we'll never succeed in taming global warming. And then there is another issue which is extremely important. How do you compensate the poor countries for the effort they make? And that's going to be one of the most difficult issues that we are going to discuss. So that's the burden sharing issue. And this is there are two difficult issues. I will basically argue global warming is not an economic issue. We know how to do it. But it's a political issue and a very difficult one. Okay? In terms of economics, we know how to do it. Even so, currently, the politicians who negotiate that, they completely forget economics. They should not. But we know how to do it. The question, there are two questions. One is a burden sharing. So in Kyoto, remember, we have created a green fund. It's a total failure, just like all the funds which have been created so far in other areas. That's a big issue. Now, here's an argument which is rather weak, but it exists. If you look at many of the successful examples of pollution abatement, drastic pollution abatement, they all have the same pattern, or many of them have the same pattern. Basically, you have people recognize as a problem there is too much pollution. Then the people who pollute the most say, oh, no, we don't want to get involved. That's going to be too expensive for us. We're not going to put in effort. Then the others say, OK, we're going to bribe you. That's as simple as that. It's not moral, but take SO2 in the US. I take the example again of SO2 in the US in 1990. There's a long fight between the East Coast, the West Coast on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Midwestern state. The Midwestern state were polluting like mad, basically emitting SO2. They wanted to reduce SO2 pollution by half within a few years. They did it, by the way. They did it very well. They reduced the SO2 production by half within a couple of years. But, of course, the two coasts had to bribe the Midwestern coast. So what did they do? Well, they gave the pollution permits to the Midwestern states, the producer of dirty electricity. And that's the way it works. Remember with Kyoto, Kyoto was a complete failure, and we could discuss why, but there was a decision basically to give to Eastern Europe some permits that was called hot air. But this is the way it works. Now, why does it work? Why doesn't a green fund work? In principle, it's the same. You make a monetary transfer. Green fund is euros or dollars, whereas permits have a euro or dollar value in the market, right? But somehow, so far, it has been more discreet somehow to use. In France, I saw no complaint, or virtually no complaint about the permits which were given to Eastern Europe. Same thing, I was in the US in 1990, and I can tell you in the Boston Globe, you will not read articles saying, it's a shame we are paying a lot of money to the Midwestern state. You know, the electorate didn't realize. Now, it's a bad argument because, of course, I'm sure that some politician opposed to pollution control will say, oh, no, this is real money. And they will point that out. But that's a discussion. But in any case, we have to compensate. You cannot get to an efficient point if you don't also have the transfer which goes with it. Enforcing the agreement is going to be a real issue. That's the second issue. So let's assume that, unlike what's going to happen, in Paris, we get to a binding agreement. We set up either a worldwide carbon tax, we set up a cap and trade mechanism, and we set up some compensating transfers. It's a lot of ambitions. We're only 2 months away or 3 months away from Paris, so it's not going to happen. Let's dream. Okay? Let's dream that we do the right thing. Okay? It's very depressing because I was giving exactly the same talk 6 years ago. You know, it's very depressing. But let's keep dreaming, and you know, there's still the issue. You know, countries sign an agreement, and okay, now we have solved the problem. But of course, you know, 4 years down the road, they will start saying, I'm a new administration. It was signed by an earlier administration. Oh, I'm not sure that China has done its job or America has done its job. I'm going to renege. Now, what do? Well, it's just like with when you renege on public debt, right? You don't repay your public debt. What do? It's not an easy solution. There is no easy solution. Fortunately, we are not anymore in the times where you will send an army and you will invade to retaliate. This is not the way it works, fortunately. So what you have to do is do various things. You know, one of the things that people have talked a lot about is, which is not, you know, without cost, is WTO sanctions. So, you know, if people don't do their job, they are dumping. It's some form of dumping. It's also some form of free riding, and therefore you should have sanctioned by the WTO. You should do some naming and shaming. Also, we know that works not that great because the states, the countries always find excuses. And after Kyoto, to renege on Kyoto, they found very good excuses not to do the job. And then you could, if you use a cap and trade mechanism, you can withhold or freeze some of the future permits, because the permits you distribute them for 30 years if you do like SO2 in the US. So you distribute them 30 years in advance. So now actually, you know, you're still using the permits which were issued in 1990, but you issue new permits for 2045. And you have to monitor indebtedness. So let's assume France, at the end of the year, has polluted more than it has permits. Well, then that means there is something like a climate debt, because it doesn't have enough permits to cover its pollution. Then it should be added up to the public debt at price, which is a price of carbon at that date. But that should be considered as sovereign debt, and it's of course a very controversial proposal, but you should use the IMF to monitor all that. Okay, innovation, maybe given it's so hot, and I would like to leave some time for questions. Innovation is very important. Innovation, just in a nutshell, innovation is, you know, especially if countries don't put much effort, which is the case now, we need a miracle. We need some good technology, and maybe it will happen, but I think it's too good an excuse not to, you know, people are using that as an excuse to do nothing. Maybe there will be a big technological breakthrough which will solve the problem, but to do that, we need to do a lot of high-level, very good R&D. And to do that, who's going to do the R&D? You need incentives. If the carbon price is zero, you have no incentive to invest in green technologies because you are not going to get any money out of it. It's only when the carbon price goes up to high levels, I mean, we have computed it should be 50 and growing to 100 euros, say, then at that point of time, if there is a credibility on the carbon price, then it becomes very profitable to have innovations. Either at the country level or at the firm level, you want to innovate because you are going to face a carbon price, so you'll be able to get royalties for your licenses to green technology. If there is no carbon price, you will get very little innovation. Compensation, negotiation, let me say a few words. I already said a few words about the compensation side. So we economists, we like to divide between efficiency. So if you want to solve the problem, it's very important, and it's least cost if the price is the same across the world, and then you let those who can depollute at a low cost do it. But you may also have financial transfers, and maybe in the form of allocation pyramids, maybe in the form of green fund. Maybe I'm pessimistic. But then there is an issue about ethics versus real politics, and that's a real big issue. And I think the rich countries have been more generous, because if you follow real politics, then you are going to get something which is completely different from the objectives that the green fund is trying to satisfy. Because if you are a country which is not going to suffer very much from global warming, you have very little incentive to join the agreement. So you are going to say, look, or if you are a country which pollutes a lot, you also have very little incentive to join the agreement, because it's going to be very costly for you. So countries which are located north, for example, they of course have much less incentives than the countries which often are poor countries, which are going to suffer the most from global warming. The countries which pollute a lot, a rich country, they have much less incentive to join an agreement. So if you followed, and that's something which is very depressing as well, if you followed realpolitik, you'll basically give permits to the rich countries and to the countries located in the north. If you follow ethics, you want to give the money to the poor countries, which are mostly located in the south. And therefore, there is something which is going to be very important to think about. We need to be more generous. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And then there are also tough issues which have to do with, can we bargain where we are 192, how many countries are there? 192 countries. Can we bargain together? Answer, it's a mess, as you might imagine. But I'm not a political scientist, and my guess is that if you took the G20, you'll get many of the emissions, not only now, but in the 20 or 30 years down the road. So you could get the big countries to agree among themselves, and then to put pressure on the other countries to join. Not on Africa. I mean, Africa is an easy thing. You can do some help, but you need the G20 countries to be on board, okay? Because they are the ones which are going to produce a lot. So what can we do? Negotiations have stalled, and the consequences could be very, very, very bad. I think we can be upset by what's going on. Now, is that naivete? Is that the lack of understanding of economics? Or is that just pure selfishness? I don't know. The point is that every politician, of course, makes nice speeches about being green. But then, when they realize they have an electorate, and the cost on being green is going to basically be on this electorate, while the benefits will be 99% abroad, and at home will be the future generations who don't vote. Because we have been very selfish with future generations. So I hope that's incompetence as opposed to selfishness, but I don't know. So the best we can get, in my view, is a path of CO2 emissions. So the path is, scientists give us a path. If we want to get to 2 degrees Celsius, there is some uncertainty, but we can correct over time. There's a path of emissions. If we go for cap and trade, you go for a CO2 market, and the number of emission permits correspond to the path you define. Then you need a governance, carrot and stick. You need some kind of a tracking system. Today, we still don't measure the pollution of countries. How can you make countries accountable for their pollution if you don't even measure the pollution? When we started, reducing the pollution of SO2 or CO2 in Europe for electricity power, for the power market, we started by measuring the emissions. because then you can make the agents accountable. And then we need a negotiation process to know how we are going to distribute those permits, who is going to contribute to the green fund, who is going to receive money for the green funds. And given the circumstances, I would say it will already be a big success. Thank you very much.